welcome to Great Conversations. I'm Barbara Aston, and I serve as the director of the Plateau Center for Native American Programs at Washington State University. And this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Alan Pinkham and Dr. Steve Evans. And tonight, they will be visiting with us about their recently published book, Lewis and Clark Among the Nez Perce, Strangers in the Land of the Nimiipuu. Welcome tonight, and thank you very much for joining us and being our guests.
Thank you.
We'll just start off with, I'm asking you to tell us about your book.
Okay. Alan, you want to go first?
Initially, we had talked about this, putting this thing together, this book, about 15 years ago. And we got more serious about, well, maybe it was about 8 or 9 years ago. And we finally got something on paper here a few years ago, and a manuscript, really rough draft. And it's something about that's lacking in history is what is a tribal view of Lewis and Clark. You know, all I've heard about the great epic journey of Lewis and Clark, you know, from white historians and anthropologists, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what about the reaction of the tribal people to Lewis and Clark? So we thought, similar thoughts, both of us, and we thought, well, why don't we put it on paper? Because he knew a lot of the history, the references and the texts and all that, and I had a lot of oral history passed down from my father and other folks. So we tried to mesh these together to come up with a tribal view of Lewis and Clark.
Yeah, just echoing what Alan said, we were working together with the Chief Joseph Foundation as the Appaloosa Horse Club group, and it was kind of designed to keep tribal youth and reservation youth with the horse orientation, so they wouldn't lose that part of their heritage. It's part of the frontier heritage, it's part of the Native American culture, frontier culture. It's something that, you know, is cross-cultural, cross-racial, and common love of the horse and the use of the horse. So Alan was the president or the chairman of that organization. I was secretary. So while we're sitting at these meetings that go on and on night after night, people are arguing at one end of the table about horse breeding, and we started chatting about Lewis and Clark bicentennial coming up on the other end of the table. And so we decided, with what his contacts and with what he knew and what he learned from his grandfather and his father, that combine that with my historical training here. I studied under Dr. Stratton here at WSU. And if we brought those two elements together, it would be pretty interesting what we could produce. And so that's how we started. We thought we could throw this together in 2 or 3 years and be ready for the bicentennial. Well, 2 or 3 years turned into half a dozen years, and that turned into a decade, and we missed the bicentennial by quite a few years. And, you know, our concept initially was to kind of a coffee table, informal presentation, but when we got into it, it was really difficult to follow that mode because my training was as a professional historian. So you start thinking in terms of bibliography, you start thinking in terms of footnotes, you start thinking of the different historical schools out there and how they're going to handle what we're presenting. The more we got into, well, we better look for corroborative evidence, we better document this in every way that we possibly can for posterity and to be taken serious, because this is, the deeper we got into the material, we realized, even though I taught tribal history at Lewis Clark State College and I taught tribal history at the University of Idaho, the more we got into the depth of the meaning of the experiences, the more we realized, no, we got to treat this serious, and we got to get it between some covers, and we got to get it out to the public while we're still young. So we really bared down the last couple of years, and we're very fortunate to find a publisher in Bismarck, North Dakota, Dan Institute, and they're affiliated with the University of Oklahoma, who's marketing our book. And so we felt now's the time to really get tough and hang in there. So we gave it 7 days a week, and some pretty long days for about a year and a half, and really intensive the last 6 months to get the book out by the end of July in this year, 2013. Yeah.
So it's been quite a working process.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's, you know.
Well, while you were working on this, what did you find most interesting or most surprising as you were doing the work?
The most, it was just the lack of tribal people from the tribal people side. And I was very heavily involved in the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. I was named to the council in 1995. And people were asking me, well, why did you even go have anything to do with Lewis and Clark? They didn't do anything for us when they came through our country. Well, see, there's negative impressions of Lewis and Clark, because of the aftermath of Lewis and Clark. Well, some of my people told me, says, don't do anything with them. They didn't do anything for us, so why even mess with this Lewis and Clark's historical event? And I thought, no, there's got to be some kind of benefit that comes out of this for the tribal people. And what I finally realized was the benefits would be tourism, some kind of economic impact on reservations, the cooperation of all the Lewis and Clark bicentennial events that could occur, and just telling our own history from the tribal perspective was the most important. And so I considered all this, and I said, well, I've got to convince my own people that there's benefits to this whole thing, to the bicentennial. And so it took a long time for me to convince other Indian people that there are benefits. Not only just telling our own history, but there's going to be economic things that we would have to consider, because tribal organizations now have their own tribal tourism groups. So they can accept tribal tours of the reservations or of their own histories or their own events as they seen it. And so I think that was probably the most important thing, just making the tribes realize that there are benefits of this Lewis and Clark bicentennial. But it took a lot of convincing. And the changing of attitudes of United States historians and university professors accepting the tribal view. Because they said, well, no, we're going to invite Indians in to come in and do parades and powwows and dances, and people like Jeannie Eater, she's a Sioux from Montana. Well, she just blew up and says, hell no, you're not going to showcase us just at your whims. So she blew up a couple of meetings, and I had to patch things back up together. But she was right, she was correct. Because it took a lot of convincing of, well, there's historians that know these things from the U.S. government side or U.S. history side, so they got this view of tribal people. And see, we had to change that attitude. So that was a very important part of this whole thing. And I hope that our book would support that.
Yeah, I found it a lot of fun and interesting. Just working with Alan was great, in a different capacity, and we tried to, we mixed it up in our research a lot. We weren't in the archives all the time. We did a lot of field proofing or field testing, whatever you want to call it. We actually went out and located village sites and located trails where different events went and happened, and we found out information that has been very lightly hit by others, or maybe not touched at all. maybe foremost amongst that was the Ordway expedition. There's been very little done on that, nothing nationally. A couple of things have been done in Idaho by Idaho professors or historians such as Merle Wells and an Idaho engineer by the name of John Peebles. They're the only two. In all of the 200 years since Lewis and Clark, nobody's done anything historically on the Ordway expedition. Now, this is a surprise to me because I didn't know this when we started. These were the first non-Indian people to be in Hell's Canyon, were John Ordway and Robert Fraser and Peter Weiser. And they were sent from Kamiah over to Hell's Canyon. It wasn't called Hell's Canyon yet, but it was about to be called Hell's Canyon, you know, in the decades that followed Lewis and Clark. So that was pretty neat. That was a surprise. And then we had fun doing that because we floated the rivers. We floated the Salmon River. We floated the Snake River. We hiked in the canyon country. We located pit houses and archaeological sites. And we shared that information with the State Archaeology Office down in Boise. And of course, we traveled to Eugene and Boise and to Lander. My wife and I went to Lander, Wyoming, and did a lot of research at the Fremont County Public Library. It was Lewis and Clark, and especially Sacagawea related because she's buried very near there at Fort Washakie. And so it was a lot of fun, a lot of surprises. Academically, one of the biggest surprises for me was, well, a couple of things. The first thing was, as Alan said, non-Indian historians have treated things in a certain way. And they're almost always fall into a kind of a rut that I would call, you know, it's like the Manifest Destiny ditch. You know, it's such a big highway that almost everybody, either you're right on the main street or you're tumbling in along the edge of somewhere. And I found, yeah, that's generally the case. And, I'm not from the East, and I'm not from a big Eastern university. And I think that really helped me because I never saw us, meaning American society, American culture, coming out here to the wilderness. I never saw it, I never felt it, because I was low class, you know, and working class, I should say, maybe working class, and I was from Pendleton, Walla Walla, Lewiston area. It was very easy for me and living on the reservation, it was very easy for me to absorb. I'm here, I'm born here, I'm raised here. It's not a wilderness, it's not a frontier. It's our life, our culture, and those people came over the mountains, and here, my home was not the United States. It was Salmon River, it was Hell's Canyon, it was the Bitterroot Mountains, but it was not the United States. And so we talked about this in our language usage and how we wanted to pose this. And so it was very important to us to include strangers and Nimiipuu in our title. And so I fell into that pretty easy, but I taught tribal history for 20 years. Barbara, I hate to tell you this, you may be already aware of it. Sometimes educators are the slowest learners. And I put myself in that class. I taught tribal history for 20 years, and I had to work with Alan and get deep into the Lewis and Clark journals. Well, the other thing is, Gary Moulton published those journals and highly edited them and did a wonderful job. And before those were available, you know, who knew what was in there? You know, they just weren't readily available. But my wife started buying me the journals. Each birthday she'd buy me another volume. So pretty soon I've got all of the volumes of the Lewis Clark journals that pertain to this area. There's about 5 of them that relate to here. And so once we got our hands on those and started getting into them, then it was surprise. There was, you know, surprise after surprise. Particularly, we noted too that the other historians have really emphasized Lewis and Clark's journals. Well, we started looking at the journal of Sergeant Ordway and Private Joseph Whitehouse. And you look at what these non-commissioned officers had to say, and oftentimes what they emphasized and what they described was very different than what the officers wrote. Now, you talk to anybody about the military, and they'll tell you, hey, listen, do you read Beetle Bailey? That'll explain a lot about the military. And even though it's a cartoon, there's an element of truth in there, which is the officers and the official government point of view is a lot different than the lower echelon. And so projecting that backwards, we got some valuable insights into, for example, canoe trip down the Clearwater River. Lewis and Clark hardly mentioned the Indians along the way. But you get into these other journals, there were lots of Indians mentioned, lots of canoes mentioned, lots of horses on the hillsides that are brought out. The camp at Weeye, Lewis and Clark just talk about little brush wickiups and stuff like that. And you wonder, gee, didn't these people ever hear of teepees? Well, when you get into White House's journal, he talks about the white leather tents all over the prairie. Well, we know what a white leather tent is. It's a teepee. So, it's a different image, and it's a different insight that they had and that we absorbed. And, so it started out to me as like, ho-hum, Lewis and Clark, I'm sick of it. Lewiston, Clarkston, Sacagawea Motel, Lewis and Clark Motel, Lewis and Clark the Community, Lewis and Clark College, Lewis and Clark College in Portland, on and on and on. Who cares, ho-hum? Well, the reality of it was quite a bit different than the image that we generally have, and the deeper we got into it, the more fun it was. And the more insight we saw into later tribal relations with the government, particularly the sovereignty issue. And we saw how 200 years ago, Lewis and Clark asked permission to cut a tree down. They asked permission to hunt. They asked for permission to camp at this location or that location. Then you turn the clock and we find, the state police shooting Indian people, sometimes not very highly provoked, in my opinion. And we see tribal members arrested by the state authorities in Oregon for hunting elk out of season, even though they don't have an elk season for Indian people in Oregon. They have a federal treaty right to hunt elk. Some of these things, my own sister-in-law, a tribal member, a full blood, goes to the Kamiah swimming pool. She's 14 years old. She's refused entrance to the pool, which is full of non-Indian children. She is sent to the doctor to prove in a written document that she doesn't have venereal disease before they let her swim in the Kamiah pool. We have some photographic evidence of Kamiah at the turn of the century, the very location where Lewis and Clark were camped and established a friendship with the Nez Perce Indians. It's a segregated town. We can show you, look at the buildings, look at the churches. Here's where the Indian people here, here are the non-Indian people here. This was just 100 years after Lewis and Clark came through and proclaimed that we will have eternal peace and friendship, and your government and our government will be best friends, and we'll always treat each other with respect, etc., etc., etc. Well, put that in your list of government bullshit. There's no other way to say it. I mean, there's a lot of ways to say it, but you can boil it down. I heard this was a short interview, so we won't go into the long explanation.
Well, I think that we're going to find a lot of interest in your book, and that it's going to open wide the door for further research and writing and bringing out that perspective, our perspective, the Native perspective.
Thank you. We should hope so. I'm not a tribal member. As far as I know, my ethnicity isn't tribal at all. So we've said that our point of view is like a 20th century reservation perspective of Lewis and Clark, and so that way I get to fit myself into the picture better.
I think that's part of the excitement too, is the collaboration, how you have worked together, and by being able to share that as well with others. Certainly looking at other collaborations that can take place. And I think as universities become more educated in research and in respecting and working with the tribes, that we'll begin to see, certainly my hope, more work as you guys have done plus just the education of our tribal members to become, you know, being those historians, which comes both from your oral tradition. They're already educated in the oral tradition. So I know our time. We are, I guess, I think to wrap this up, I will just ask what the one thing would be, not that there's just one thing, but what you might share as being the point you would want people to leave with after your presentation or after reading your book. What is if there's one thing to stand out in their mind as a new understanding for them?
Well, I think what's important, and just that Indian people can identify with what we have written in the book from the perspective of the tribe of the time of 1805 and 06. Because this is a self-identity that has been taken away from us and then given back to us piece by piece, like recognition of tribal sovereignty. That's a piece of us. Recognition of our horse culture. You know, well, you can have it back. After they took our horses away and slaughtered our horses after 1877. And now they can, well, you can keep a horse, but one without spots. Say it's a farm horse. You can have a farm horse back, but not a good parade horse or buffalo horse or riding horse. You know, so they were giving it back to us, our own culture, piece by piece. Well, if you can identify from the tribal perspective of our reaction to Lewis and Clark, you start to identify yourself. You know, you're going to go out and you're going to dig pumice. You're going to gather cows and katiek and other roots and berries, huckleberries. You're going to go out and hunt and fish just like we did at the time of Lewis and Clark. My sons hunt and fish. But they don't hunt and fish like we used to. You know, it's close to what they practice, but they haven't gone completely back to the old ways because the old ways aren't there. We can't go out and in isolation and hear nothing but the woods and the animals and the birds and the insects out there because you hear a jet plane go overhead. You know, it's not the same. Our world has been altered. You know, and part of these prophecies that we have told about the coming of the white man, we try to put into the book. You know, some of it's come out, but there's some prophecies that tells us what was going to happen to us way before the white man even came among us. So this is part of the identity that has been taken away from us and been given back to us piece by piece. Now, even though we are in an altered world, our world had been turned over, but now we can realize that there is this place of earth, this sense of place that we are created from. We are the people of the earth. We are people of the water. We are people of the air. We are people of the blood of the monster. That's who we are. And the Creator and the Coyote made us this way. So if we can identify ourselves as tribal people, then we can face all these changes that have come about. And hopefully one day, after this, even this recognition of Columbus Day, since 1492, over 500 years have passed. Well, there's got to be a way that Indian people can identify themselves as individuals and as tribal people, that there is a uniqueness in what they are and who they can be. This is what I would hope would come out of this book.
Thank you. Would you like to add?
Well, just a second, what Alan said, our foreword was written by a friend of Alan's named Fred Hoxie. And And although I met him before, I can't say that, you know, he was a friend of mine, but he has been a friend of Alan's, and I was very happy. I heard him speak before, and I was very impressed with what he had to say. And so he did agree to write our foreword, and in there he entitled it, "What Every School Child Should Know." And he started out with a quotation from a former Supreme Court justice, that every school child knows that the West was taken by force, and they know that. And after he reviewed our manuscript, he went back and finished his foreword, and in there he said that these two gentlemen have shown that history isn't predestined, and that it's full of possibility. Now, and that's what every school child should know. And that it was a human-to-human relationship, and it wasn't a superior culture, overwhelming an inferior culture at all. Now, we didn't set that out as a predetermination when we wrote our book, that we want to show that. We just told the story. But in the story, it becomes very obvious that there's an awful lot of respect and equanimity going on in the relationship between these groups. Well, it's part of our hope is that we look backwards in order to look forwards. And sometimes when we look at where we are, we're not happy where we are. We don't have to be where we are. We can choose a different path. We can choose a less violent path. We can choose a more respectful path. And we'll make a better place for everybody. This was Alan's dad's dream, was that you've got these different people. They're not going to remain the same, but culture cuts both ways. Felix Cohen wrote an essay about it back in the 60s. I mean, I'm a child of the 60s, and I remember going through this before. So it's like, we're going through this again. We learn anything the first time? That the culture cuts both ways. So you're not just Americanizing American Indians. American Indians are humanizing non-Indian America. And the Nez Perce are a tiny little group of people in a giant nation. There are only about 4,000 Nez Perces. There are only half as many Nez Perces as there were at the time of Lewis and Clark, possibly. So we hope that this small group can thrive and expand and continue to work together with the larger group in a way that will be mutually profitable, both spiritually, intellectually, and hopefully economically as well.
Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Good to be
Thank
back.
you.
Good to be back on campus. You know,
Yes.
when you're a cougar, you just
Thunder, fire and torrent, hunger, need and fear, slavery, grief, confusion, freedom waiting near, the sound of spirit horses, hoofbeats in the sky, snow and